The touching bond between a blind boy and a farmer's bull. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching this video from. The sound of tires crunching on gravel made George Patterson look up from the fence post he was mending. A silver sedan was making its way up the long drive to Riverside Station, dust trailing behind it like a wedding veil. George squinted against the late morning sun, not recognizing the vehicle. Visitors were rare out here in rural New South Wales, 40 kilometers from the nearest town. George was 73 years old, with hands gnarled from 7 decades of farm work and a face weathered like the red gum posts that lined his property. He'd been born in the bedroom of the old stone farmhouse his grandfather had built, delivered by a country doctor who'd arrived on horseback. He'd worked this land his entire life, never married, never had children of his own. The cattle were his family, this farm his purpose. The car pulled up near the barn, and a woman stepped out. She was maybe 40, with tired eyes and clothes that marked her as a city person. Clean jeans without a single grass stain, a pressed shirt, shoes meant for footpaths rather than paddocks. But it was the passenger that caught George's attention. A young boy, maybe 7 or 8, emerged from the back seat with the careful movements of someone navigating an unfamiliar world. His hand reached out, finding the car door, then his mother's arm. The boy was blind. George could tell from the way his head tilted, listening rather than looking, from the white cane his mother handed him, from the dark glasses that covered his eyes despite the shade of the barn. "G'day," George called out, setting down his tools and walking over. "Can I help you folks?" The woman smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mr. Patterson, I'm Jennifer Cooper. We spoke on the phone yesterday about the farm tour." George's memory caught up with him. Right. The woman from Sydney who'd called asking if her son could visit a working farm, touch the animals, experience country life. He'd agreed, mostly because he could hear the desperation in her voice, the kind that came from a parent trying everything to help their child. Of course. Sorry, memory's not what it used to be." He extended his hand to Jennifer, then crouched down to the boy's level. "And you must be Oliver. I'm George. Welcome to Riverside Station, mate." Oliver turned his head toward George's voice, a small smile appearing on his face. "Hello, Mr. Patterson. Mum says you have cows." "Too bloody many of them," George laughed. "But yeah, we've got about 300 head of cattle, Herefords mostly, and one very special Charolais bull named Duke." "Can I meet them?" The simple question, asked with such hope, made something in George's chest tighten. "Absolutely, mate. That's why you're here." Jennifer touched her son's shoulder gently. "Oliver lost his sight 2 years ago," she explained quietly. "Retinoblastoma. The cancer's gone now, but the doctors couldn't save his vision. We've been trying different therapies, different experiences. His counselor suggested animal interaction might help with his spatial awareness and confidence." George nodded, understanding more than she probably realized. He'd seen injured animals recover, seen calves born weak become strong. Healing took many forms. "Well, let's start with something gentle," he suggested. "I've got an old cow named Bessie who's sweet as honey. She's in the barn out of the heat." He led them into the barn, the temperature dropping noticeably in the shade. The smell of hay and animals filled the air, and George watched Oliver's nose wrinkle slightly as he adjusted to the new scents. Bessie was in her usual stall, a 15-year-old Hereford who'd stopped producing calves, but George couldn't bring himself to sell. She was too gentle, too much a part of the place. "Bessie got someone special for you to meet," George said softly, unlatching the stall. The old cow raised her head, chewing her cud lazily. "Oliver, I'm going to guide your hand to touch her, all right? She's very calm, won't hurt you." He took Oliver's small hand, so much smaller than his own work-roughened paws, and slowly brought it to Bessie's neck. The moment Oliver's fingers made contact with the cow's warm hide, his face transformed. Wonder replaced uncertainty. his fingers spreading out to feel the texture of her coat, the solid muscle beneath. "She's so warm," Oliver breathed, "and soft. Can she feel me touching her?" "Sure can, mate. See how her ear just twitched? That's because she likes it. You can pat her, scratch behind her ears if you want." For 20 minutes, Oliver explored Bessie with his hands, George guiding him, explaining what he was touching. Jennifer stood back, tears streaming silently down her face as she watched her son smile more broadly than he had in months. They moved through the barn, meeting chickens that made Oliver giggle when they pecked grain from his palm, an old border collie named Meg, who licked his face with enthusiasm, and several more docile cows. With each animal, Oliver's confidence grew, his movements becoming less tentative. "Mr. Patterson," Oliver said as they walked back toward the main yard, "you mentioned a special bull." "Duke?" George hesitated. Duke was special, all right, but not in ways that made him suitable for a blind child to meet. The massive Charolais bull weighed nearly a ton, with a temperament that could turn from calm to aggressive without warning. Duke was kept in a separate, reinforced paddock away from the main herd, except during breeding season. "Duke's a bit too big for visiting today, mate," George said carefully. "Maybe another time." But fate, as it often did on farms, had other plans. As they rounded the corner of the barn, there was Duke. Having somehow broken through a section of fencing George had been meaning to reinforce for weeks, the massive cream-colored bull stood in the yard, his enormous head lowered, looking directly at them. Jennifer gasped, instinctively pulling Oliver behind her. George's heart hammered as he assessed the situation. Duke in the open yard was dangerous. Duke in the open yard with visitors, with a child, was potentially deadly. "Stay very still," George whispered, his voice barely audible. "Don't make any sudden movements." Jennifer slowly backed toward the barn door with Oliver. But before Jennifer could move, Oliver spoke up, his voice curious rather than afraid. "Is that Duke? I can hear him breathing. He sounds really big." "Oliver, quiet," his mother hissed, her voice tight with fear. Duke took a step forward, his massive hooves thudding against the packed earth. George positioned himself between the bull and his visitors, his mind racing through options. He had no stockwhip, no polypipe, nothing to drive the bull back. His rifle was in the house, useless at this distance. The bull took another step, and George's muscles tensed, preparing to shout, to wave his arms, to do whatever it took to draw Duke's attention away from the woman and child. But then something extraordinary happened. Duke stopped. His huge head tilted slightly, and he made a sound, not an aggressive bellow, but a low, almost questioning rumble. His dark eyes weren't fixed on George or Jennifer. They were looking at Oliver. "Mr. Patterson," Oliver said softly. "He doesn't sound angry. Can I meet him?" "Absolutely not," Jennifer said sharply, her arm tight around her son. "George, what do we do?" But George was watching Duke with the eye of a man who'd worked with bulls his entire life. The animal's body language was all wrong for aggression. His tail wasn't lashing, his head wasn't truly lowered in threat, his muscles weren't bunched for a charge. If anything, Duke looked curious. "Oliver," George said slowly, an idea forming that his rational mind told him was insane, but his instinct said might just work. "How do you feel right now? Are you scared?" Oliver considered this. "No. Should I be? He sounds curious, not mean, like he wants to know who I am." Jennifer stared at her son. "Oliver, you can't possibly—" "Hold on," George interrupted gently. He'd seen something in that moment, a connection he couldn't quite explain. Duke had never shown interest in visitors before. Usually, he was aggressive or indifferent, certainly never gentle. But something about Oliver had caught the bull's attention in a different way. George made a decision that would either be the wisest or most foolish of his life. He walked slowly toward Duke, his hands visible, his movements calm. The bull watched him come, but didn't react aggressively. George placed his hand on Duke's massive head, feeling the solid bone beneath the hide, the warmth of the animal. "Duke, mate," he said softly, "we've got a special visitor today. A brave young bloke who can't see you but wants to meet you. Reckon you can be on your best behavior." The bull's ear flicked toward George's voice. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Duke lowered his head further. Not in threat, but almost in submission. It was the same posture George had seen cows take with their calves, a gentling of their entire bearing. "Jennifer," George called back, "I know this sounds mad, but I think Duke wants to meet Oliver. I've worked with this bull for 8 years, and I've never seen him like this. But it's your call, your son, your decision." Jennifer looked at Oliver, whose face was turned toward the sound of the bull's breathing, showing no fear at all. She looked at George, at the way he stood confidently beside the massive animal, and she made a choice based on something mothers know, but can't always explain. "Trust, if you think it's safe," she said, her voice shaking slightly. George walked back and knelt beside Oliver. "Mate, I'm going to take your hand and walk you over to Duke. He's very big, probably the biggest animal you'll ever touch. We're going to go slow, and you're going to listen to me very carefully. All right?" Oliver nodded, his hand finding George's. Together, they walked across the yard, Jennifer following close behind, every muscle in her body tense. Duke stood absolutely still, waiting. "Now," George said quietly, guiding Oliver's hand forward, "reach out slowly. You're going to touch his nose first. It'll be wet and warm." Oliver's small hand made contact with Duke's massive muzzle. The bull remained motionless, his breathing steady. Oliver's fingers explored, carefully tracing the bull's nose, moving up to feel the broad forehead. "He's enormous," Oliver whispered in awe. "I can feel how strong he is. Can I touch his horns?" George hesitated, then nodded. "Very carefully. They're sharp at the tips." He guided Oliver's hands to Duke's horns, letting the boy trace their length and curve. Duke stood like a statue carved from cream-colored stone, more patient than George had ever seen him. This was the same bull that had charged a tractor last spring, the same animal that had to be kept away from other males for fear of violent confrontation. Yet here he stood, letting a blind child explore him with complete trust. "Mr. Patterson," Oliver said, his voice full of wonder, "I think he likes me." "I think you're right, mate." For the next hour, something impossible unfolded in that dusty yard. Oliver, with George's careful supervision, spent time with Duke, touching him, even leaning against his massive side as the bull lay down in the shade. Jennifer took photos on her phone, tears streaming down her face, capturing something she knew no one would believe without visual proof. Duke's behavior remained gentle throughout, his normal aggressive tendencies completely absent. He moved slowly around Oliver, seeming to understand the boy's limitations, his need for consistency and predictability. When Oliver stumbled slightly over uneven ground, Duke moved his body to provide support, allowing the boy to steady himself against a ton of solid muscle. "I've never seen anything like this," Jennifer kept saying. "Never in my life." George couldn't disagree. In 7 decades of farming, through working with hundreds of cattle, he'd never witnessed anything similar. It was as if Duke recognized something in Oliver, some quality that made the aggressive bull transform into a gentle giant. As the afternoon wore on and shadows lengthened across the yard, George finally suggested they should probably wrap up. Oliver protested but eventually agreed, giving Duke one final pat on his broadside. "Can I come back?" he asked George. "Can I visit Duke again?" George looked at Jennifer, then at Duke, who was watching Oliver with those intelligent, dark eyes. "I reckon Duke would like that very much, mate." They arranged for Oliver to visit the following Saturday, and then every Saturday after that, if things went well. As George watched their car disappear down the drive, he walked over to Duke, who was standing calmly in the yard, showing no signs of wanting to return to his paddock. "What the bloody hell was that all about?" George asked the bull, scratching behind his ear. Duke just looked at him with those knowing eyes, keeping whatever secret he'd discovered to himself. The following Saturday arrived with clear skies and the promise of another scorcher. George found himself checking his watch more often than usual, a strange nervousness in his chest. He'd spent the morning making sure Duke's area was immaculate, the water trough cleaned, fresh hay put out. He felt foolish, preparing for a child's visit like it was royalty coming to call, but he couldn't help himself. When the silver sedan appeared on the drive, George was surprised to see 3 vehicles following it. Jennifer got out looking apologetic. "I hope you don't mind," Oliver told his support group about last week, and some of the other parents wanted to see if their children might benefit from the same experience. Behind her emerged 4 more children, ranging in age from 5 to about 10, each with varying degrees of visual impairment. Some had white canes, others held parents' hands, navigating the unfamiliar environment with caution. Oliver was already calling out for Duke, his face turned toward the barn with unmistakable excitement. George felt a moment of panic. Duke's patience with one blind child was miracle enough. 5 children might be pushing whatever mysterious force had made last week possible, but looking at their faces, at the hope in the parents' eyes, he couldn't bring himself to turn them away. "Duke!" Oliver called out. "Mr. Patterson, where's Duke?" As if summoned, the massive bull appeared from around the barn, where he'd apparently been waiting. His eyes found Oliver immediately, and he made that same low, rumbling sound from last week. Oliver's face lit up with a smile that could have powered the whole farm. What happened over the next 2 hours defied everything George thought he knew about cattle behavior. Duke moved among the children with the patience of a therapy dog, standing still while small hands explored him, lowering himself to the ground so shorter children could reach, making soft, encouraging sounds when one little girl became frightened and needed coaxing. The other children were enchanted. 6-year-old Emma, who had partial vision, described Duke's color to those who couldn't see at all. 10-year-old Marcus, blind since birth, traced the bull's features with methodical precision, building a mental image through touch. 5-year-old Lucy simply wrapped her arms around Duke's leg and declared him the best friend she'd ever had. Parents stood in clusters, filming, photographing, some crying openly at seeing their children interact with such confidence and joy. George found himself having to clear his throat more than once, turning away to compose himself. "This is incredible," said Martin, Marcus's father. "My son has been terrified of animals since losing his sight. He thought they'd hurt him because he couldn't see them coming. But look at him now." George watched Marcus running his hands along Duke's back, the bull standing perfectly still, his tail swishing occasionally to ward off flies, but never in a way that might startle the children. "Your bull is special," Martin continued. "I don't know how, but he understands these kids. He knows they need him to be gentle." Over the following months, the Saturday visits became a fixture at Riverside Station. Word spread through disability support networks, schools for the blind, therapy centers. George found himself hosting groups of children almost every weekend, and Duke never faltered in his gentle behavior. But it was Oliver who remained Duke's clear favorite. The boy came every Saturday without fail, and the bond between them deepened in ways that seemed to transcend normal animal-human relationships. Duke would hear Oliver's voice from the car and immediately move to the gate, waiting. Oliver could now navigate the farm independently, using Duke as his guide, his hand resting on the bull's broad back as they walked together through the paddocks. Jennifer confided in George that Oliver's entire demeanor had changed. His confidence had grown, his spatial awareness improved dramatically, his willingness to try new things had blossomed. The boy who'd been withdrawn and fearful after losing his sight was becoming adventurous again. "His therapist can't believe the progress," she told George one afternoon, watching Oliver and Duke rest in the shade together. She says animal therapy is effective, but this is beyond anything she's seen. Oliver talks about Duke constantly, draws pictures of him, even though he can't see them. Duke's changed his life, George. George felt something shift in his chest. His whole life, he'd raised cattle for beef, for profit, measuring their worth in kilos and market prices. But Duke had become something else entirely. He had value that couldn't be measured in dollars, performing a role no human therapy could replicate. The local newspaper heard about the miracle bull and sent a reporter, a young woman named Sarah, who spent a whole Saturday observing. Her article, titled "The Bull Who Sees with His Heart," was picked up by metropolitan papers, then national news services. Soon, George's phone was ringing constantly, requests for visits, interviews, even a film crew from a documentary company. George agreed to a few interviews but tried to keep things low-key. He didn't want Duke's life disrupted, didn't want this to become a circus. The children and their families were what mattered. One Saturday in autumn, nearly 6 months after Oliver's first visit, something unexpected happened. A man arrived in an expensive 4-wheel drive, wearing a suit that looked out of place on a cattle station. He introduced himself as Richard Chen, a cattle breeder from Queensland. "Mr. Patterson, I've been following the stories about your bull. I breed premium Charolais cattle, and Duke's bloodline is exceptional. I'd like to make you an offer to purchase him. Name your price." George felt his jaw tighten. "Duke's not for sale." "I understand attachment," Chen continued smoothly, "but I'm prepared to offer you 3 times his market value. He'd be well cared for, used for breeding. Think of the genetics he could pass on." "I said he's not for sale. Mr. Patterson, be reasonable. He's a bull, a farm animal. Yes, he's become a local celebrity, but surely you can see that his value as breeding stock far exceeds his value as a therapy animal. I'm offering you $60,000. George looked over at Duke, who was lying in the shade with Oliver curled up against his side, reading a braille book aloud to the bull. Around them, 3 other children were playing, using Duke's massive form as home base in a game of Tiggy they'd adapted for their needs. "Mate," George said quietly, "there's not enough money in the world. Duke's home is here. His job is here. These kids need him. He's not going anywhere." Chen frowned. "That's very sentimental, Mr. Patterson, but not very practical. What happens when the bull ages, when he's no longer profitable? You'll regret not taking this offer. Then I'll regret it. Now get off my property." After Chen left, George stood for a long time watching Oliver and Duke. The boy was still reading, his fingers moving across the braille dots, his voice steady and confident. Duke's ear would occasionally twitch toward Oliver's voice, his eyes half closed in contentment. Jennifer appeared beside George, having witnessed the exchange. "Thank you," she said simply, "for putting Oliver above profit." "It's not just Oliver," George replied. "Duke's happy here. You can see it in him. He's found his purpose, and it's not standing in some breeding facility. It's right here, doing this." That evening, long after the families had gone home, George sat on his veranda with a beer, Duke grazing peacefully in the nearby paddock. The bull had returned to his normal routine, but George knew that come next Saturday, he'd transform again into the gentle giant the children needed. 3 years passed. Oliver was now 11, tall and confident, his white cane an extension of himself rather than a burden. He could navigate Riverside Station better than some sighted visitors, knowing every fence line, every gate, every dip in the terrain. And always, Duke was nearby. The Saturdays had continued without fail. George had built a proper covered area near the barn, with benches for parents and a smooth concrete floor that was easier for the children to navigate. Local businesses donated funds for the improvements, touched by the story of the miracle bull. George accepted help reluctantly, never comfortable with attention, but grateful that the children would have a better experience. Duke was now 11 years old himself, starting to show his age. His movements were slightly slower, his muzzle had more grey. George knew that bulls typically lived to about 15 or 16 years, sometimes less, depending on their life stress. Duke had lived well, relatively speaking, but age came for everyone eventually. One Saturday morning in spring, George noticed Duke moving stiffly, favouring his left rear leg. He called Dr. Sarah Chen, not related to the breeder who'd tried to buy Duke, the local vet who'd been treating his cattle for years. She examined Duke carefully while Oliver stood nearby, his face creased with worry. "Arthritis," Sarah confirmed. "Common in bulls his age, especially ones his size. The weight puts strain on the joints. I can give him anti-inflammatories. But George, you need to prepare yourself. He's getting old. His working days might be numbered." "What does that mean?" Oliver asked, his voice small. "Is Duke going to die?" George knelt beside the boy, choosing his words carefully. "Not yet, mate, but Duke's getting older, same as me. Everything has its time. We'll keep him comfortable, keep him happy for as long as we can." Oliver's hands found Duke's head, stroking the familiar contours. "I don't want him to hurt." "None of us do, son." Over the following months, George adjusted Duke's schedule. Fewer children per session, shorter visits, more rest time. He made sure Duke had the best feed, the most comfortable bedding, constant access to clean water. He found himself checking on the bull multiple times a day, sometimes just standing at the fence, watching him graze, memorizing the sight. Jennifer noticed the change in George, too. "You love him," she said one afternoon. "Duke's not just livestock to you anymore." George didn't deny it. "Never thought I'd get attached to a bull. Spent my whole life treating them as business assets. But Duke, he's different. He's taught me something about purpose, about value beyond what you can measure in dollars." As winter approached, Oliver celebrated his 12th birthday. For his present, he asked for something unusual. He wanted to spend a whole day at Riverside Station, just him and Duke and George. No other children, no other parents. Just the three of them. Jennifer agreed, dropping Oliver off early on a Saturday morning with a packed lunch and a promise to return at sunset. George had planned various activities, but in the end, they mostly just spent time together. Oliver and Duke wandered the property, the boy's hand resting on the bull's back, George following at a distance, watching over them both. They stopped by the creek, where the water ran clear over smooth stones. Duke drank deeply while Oliver sat on the bank, his feet in the water, talking to the bull about school, about his friends, about his dreams of becoming a veterinarian someday so he could help animals like Duke helped him. "Mr. Patterson," Oliver called over, "can I ask you something?" George settled himself on the bank beside the boy. "Course, mate. Why do you think Duke chose me? That first day, Mum said he could have been dangerous, but he was gentle instead. Why?" George had asked himself the same question 1,000 times. "I don't rightly know, Oliver. Maybe he sensed something in you. Maybe he understood what you needed. Animals know things we don't always understand. They feel things we can't explain. I was so scared back then," Oliver admitted. "After I lost my sight, I was scared of everything. Scared I'd never be normal again, never be able to do anything by myself. But Duke made me feel safe. Like even though I couldn't see, I could still experience the world, still be part of it. You were always part of it, mate. Duke just helped you remember that." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the creek burble and Duke's steady breathing. George felt an overwhelming gratitude for the strange series of events that had brought this boy and this bull together, that had given his final years purpose beyond anything he'd imagined. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that Oliver couldn't see but could feel in the warmth on his face, they made their way back to the barn. Duke settled in his favorite spot, and Oliver curled up against him like he had so many times before. "George," Oliver said quietly. "When Duke's time comes, will you tell me? I want to be here. I want to say goodbye properly." The question hit George like a physical blow, but he kept his voice steady. "I promise, mate. When that time comes, you'll be here." 2 years later, on a crisp autumn morning, that time arrived. George woke, knowing something was wrong, that inexplicable sense that farmers develop after decades of working with animals. He found Duke lying in his paddock, his breathing labored, his eyes dim but peaceful. Sarah came quickly, examined him, and gave George the look he'd been dreading. His heart's giving out. I can see it in his symptoms. Could be hours, could be days, but not long. I can ease his passing if you want." "Not yet," George said. "There's someone who needs to say goodbye first." He called Jennifer, explained the situation. She and Oliver arrived within the hour, Oliver's face pale but composed. The boy knelt beside Duke, his hands finding the bull's great head, stroking the grey muzzle, the soft ears. "Hey, old friend," Oliver whispered. "I'm here. I'm right here." Duke's tail moved slightly, acknowledgement. His breathing steadied a bit, as if he'd been waiting for this moment, for this person. For 3 hours, Oliver sat with Duke, talking to him, thanking him, sharing memories. Other families came when they heard the news, children who'd found confidence through Duke's gentle patience. They formed a quiet circle, each one touching the bull, saying their goodbyes. As the afternoon sun reached its peak, Duke's breathing changed. George recognized the pattern. He looked at Sarah, who nodded gently. It was time. "Oliver," George said softly, "he's ready now. He's not in pain, just tired. Is it all right if Dr. Sarah helps him go peacefully?" Oliver nodded, tears streaming down his face beneath his dark glasses. His hand remained on Duke's head as Sarah administered the injection. Within moments, Duke's breathing slowed, then stopped. The great bull was gone. The silence that followed was profound. Then Oliver spoke, his voice steady despite the tears. "Thank you, Duke, for everything, for making me brave again, for showing me that being blind doesn't mean being helpless, for being my friend when I needed one most." They buried Duke on a hill overlooking the creek, where he'd spent so many peaceful afternoons. George commissioned a stone marker, simple but solid. Duke, a bull who changed lives. In the months that followed, George struggled with Duke's absence. The farm felt emptier, Saturdays quieter. But then Jennifer came to him with an idea. What if they created a program, training other cattle using Duke's methods, helping more children? They could call it Duke's Legacy. George agreed. With Jennifer's organizational skills and George's knowledge of cattle, they began carefully selecting and training young bulls, looking for those with the right temperament. Not every animal could do what Duke had done. His gift had been truly special, but some showed promise. Oliver, now 14, became involved too, helping assess which animals might work with the children, his experience with Duke giving him insights others lacked. He was still working toward his dream of veterinary medicine, inspired by the bull who'd changed his life. 5 years after Duke's passing, Riverside Station had become a recognized therapy center, hosting not just children with vision impairments, but kids with all kinds of disabilities. George, now 78 days, had trained 3 bulls in Duke's gentle ways. None quite matched the original, but they helped, and that was what mattered. On the anniversary of Duke's death, George and Oliver, now a confident 18-year-old about to start university, stood by the grave on the hill. The sun was setting, painting the sky in those same orange and pink hues from years before. "Do you think he knew?" Oliver asked. "How much he mattered?" George thought about all the children Duke had helped, all the lives he'd touched, the legacy that continued growing even after his death. "Yeah, mate, I reckon he knew. Animals always know when they're loved." Oliver smiled, placing his hand on the stone marker, tracing Duke's name in the carved letters. "I'm going to help animals like him helped me. That's my promise to him. He'd be proud of you, Oliver. I know I am." As they walked back down the hill together, George looked back once at Duke's grave. In his mind, he could still see the massive cream-colored bull standing there, patient and gentle, teaching an old farmer that profit wasn't the only measure of worth, that sometimes the greatest value came from the simplest acts of kindness. The touching bond between a blind boy and a farmer's bull had ended, but its ripples continued spreading outward, touching lives, changing perspectives, proving that love and connection could transcend species, circumstances, and even death itself. Duke's legacy lived on, in every child who found courage, in every gentle animal who offered comfort, in every person who learned that sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected places.